Absurd medieval trends that need to come back. When people imagine medieval life, they usually picture mud, disease, iron armor, and a general lack of comfort. And yes, medieval life was often brutal. But hidden beneath the hardship was something unexpected: creativity, humor, social flair, and trends so strange they feel almost modern. In fact, many medieval trends weren't just practical. They were expressive. They were communal. Some were downright ridiculous. And strangely enough, a few of them might actually make modern life more interesting if they came back. Today, we're diving into the most absurd medieval trends that honestly deserve a second chance. Not because medieval life was better, it wasn't. But because these strange customs reveal something we've lost: boldness, shared rituals, and a willingness to be a little weird in public. Let's start with one of the most iconic and misunderstood medieval trends of all time: wearing ridiculously long shoes. In medieval Europe, especially during the 14th and 15th centuries, fashion took a sharp turn toward the absurd, literally. People began wearing shoes called poulaines, which had extremely long, pointed toes. And when I say long, I mean dangerously long. Some shoes extended several inches beyond the foot. Others stretched over a foot in length and had to be tied to the wearer's leg just so they wouldn't flop around while walking. These shoes were completely impractical. You couldn't run in them. You couldn't work in them. Walking upstairs was a challenge. And that was exactly the point. Long shoes were a status symbol. The longer the toe, the higher your social rank. Nobles wore the longest points, while peasants were often restricted by law to shorter ones. Yes, there were actual laws regulating how long your shoes were allowed to be. The absurdity wasn't a flaw. It was a flex. Imagine that today. Instead of luxury cars or designer handbags, people competing over who has the most inconvenient footwear possible. And honestly, that kind of visible absurdity feels refreshing. Medieval fashion wasn't about blending in. It was about being seen. Public bathhouses as social hubs. Another medieval trend that deserves a comeback is the public bathhouse, and not in the modern, awkward gym shower sense. Medieval bathhouses were lively social spaces. People didn't just go there to get clean. They went to relax, gossip, eat, drink, and socialize. Some bathhouses even served full meals and wine while people soaked in hot water. In many cities, bathhouses were open to all social classes. Nobles, merchants, and craftsmen bathed in the same spaces. It was one of the rare places where social boundaries softened. Bathing together wasn't considered strange. It was considered healthy, civilized, and enjoyable. Compare that to today, where bathing is completely private and often rushed. Showers are something we squeeze in between responsibilities. Medieval people, despite having fewer comforts, understood something important: cleanliness could be communal and enjoyable, not just functional. Of course, hygiene standards were different, and some bathhouses eventually gained reputations for extra activities. But the core idea, shared relaxation, feels like something we've lost. Wearing bells just for the drama. In medieval times, people didn't move quietly unless they had a reason to. Many wore bells on their clothing, shoes, or hats. Not for safety. Not for religion. But for flair. Bells announced your presence before you even spoke. They jingled as you walked, danced, or gestured. For performers, jesters, and entertainers, bells were a way to command attention. For nobles, they were a sign of wealth. Small metal objects weren't cheap. Even ordinary people sometimes added bells during festivals or celebrations, turning everyday movement into a kind of music. Today, silence is valued. Loudness is often seen as rude. Medieval society was the opposite. Sound meant life. Sound meant activity. Bringing this trend back wouldn't mean everyone jingling down the street, but the idea of embracing sound instead of suppressing it? That's something modern culture could use. Laughing at authority in public. One of the most surprising medieval trends was how openly people mocked power, at least during specific times. Feast days, festivals, and carnivals often turned social rules upside down. Peasants dressed as kings. Clergy were parodied. Authority figures were mocked openly in plays, songs, and public performances. This wasn't rebellion. It was ritual. These events allowed society to release tension. Everyone knew the jokes weren't permanent challenges to power, but they reminded rulers that they weren't untouchable. Modern societies often struggle with criticism. It becomes polarized, hostile, or dangerous. Medieval people had a structured outlet for satire. For a brief moment, laughter was allowed to level the social playing field. That kind of organized absurdity might actually make modern politics less explosive. Sumptuary laws, fashion with rules. Here's a trend that sounds awful but was actually fascinating. Medieval governments passed sumptuary laws that controlled what people could wear based on class. Certain colors, fabrics, and accessories were reserved for nobility. Others were banned for lower classes. At first glance, this feels oppressive. And it was. But it also made fashion deeply symbolic. What you wore told a story, instantly. Social roles were visible, and clothing carried meaning beyond personal taste. Today, fashion is fast, disposable, and often meaningless. Medieval fashion was slow, regulated, and loaded with symbolism. Bringing back strict clothing laws would be a disaster, but bringing back intentional fashion? That might be worth reconsidering. Public storytelling as entertainment. Before books were common, storytelling was a public event. Stories weren't whispered in bedrooms or watched on screens. They were performed aloud in marketplaces, taverns, and town squares. Traveling storytellers memorized epic tales, local legends, and exaggerated news from other regions. They used voice, gesture, and timing, not special effects. And people gathered. They listened together. They reacted together. Today, entertainment is private and isolated. Headphones, screens, algorithms. Medieval storytelling was communal. Everyone heard the same story and discussed it afterward. That shared experience built social bonds, something modern entertainment often lacks. If medieval life teaches us anything, it's that people didn't try to hide the ridiculous parts of being human. They leaned into them. Where modern society tends to smooth out odd behavior, medieval culture often amplified it. And nowhere is that more obvious than in how medieval people treated beauty, self-expression, and public embarrassment. Let's talk about medieval beauty standards, because they were strange, extreme, and unapologetically artificial. Shaving your hairline to look smarter. In medieval Europe, especially among noble women, a high forehead was considered a sign of intelligence, refinement, and beauty. So what did people do? They shaved their hairlines back. Not a little. Sometimes dramatically. Hair was removed from the front of the scalp, the temples, and even the eyebrows to create a tall, smooth forehead. Some women went even further and plucked their eyebrows completely, replacing them with faint pencil-like lines or leaving the face bare. This wasn't accidental. It was fashionable. The logic was simple. The forehead was associated with the brain. A bigger forehead meant a bigger mind. Beauty wasn't about youth or natural features, it was about signaling intellect and status. Compare that to today, where beauty trends constantly chase youthfulness and perfection. Medieval beauty wasn't about pretending to be natural. It was about showing effort. Bringing back the idea that beauty can look strange, intentional, and symbolic, rather than effortless, might actually reduce some modern pressure to look naturally perfect. Wearing absurdly large hats for no practical reason. Medieval headwear deserves its own category of absurdity. People wore towering hats, horned headdresses, cone-shaped hennins, wide-brimmed felt hats, and fabric constructions so elaborate they required pins, wires, and internal frames just to stay upright. Some hats were so tall they brushed doorways. Others were so wide they made sitting near someone a challenge. And once again, practicality was irrelevant. These hats existed to command attention. They announced wealth, marital status, and regional identity. You could walk into a medieval town and immediately tell where someone was from based on their headwear alone. Today, hats are functional or minimal. Medieval hats were theatrical. There's something powerful about that. Clothing wasn't meant to disappear into the background. It was meant to speak. Public shaming that was more embarrassing than harmful. Now let's talk about a medieval practice that sounds harsh, but was often more psychological than violent. Public shaming. Medieval societies relied heavily on reputation. Your name mattered. Trust mattered. And instead of long prison sentences, many communities used public embarrassment as punishment for minor offenses. People might be required to stand in a public place wearing a sign describing what they did. Others might be placed in stocks where passers-by could laugh, point, or mock. The goal wasn't injury. The goal was correction. And here's the absurd part: it worked surprisingly well. People feared embarrassment more than fines. Public accountability meant something because communities were tight-knit. Everyone knew everyone. Today, accountability is abstract. Systems are distant. Shame exists online, but without context or proportion. Medieval punishment, for all its flaws, understood something modern systems struggle with: social behavior is shaped by community reaction. Of course, this could be abused, and often was. But the idea of restoring accountability without long-term harm is something worth examining. Feast days that ignored all restraint. Medieval people worked hard. Very hard. For most of the year, life was repetitive and exhausting. That's why feast days were intentionally excessive. When festivals happened, restraint disappeared. People ate enormous quantities of food. Meat, bread, cheese, pastries, ale, wine, all consumed publicly and enthusiastically. Normal rules about moderation were temporarily suspended. This wasn't accidental indulgence. It was planned excess. The logic was psychological. By allowing short periods of chaos and indulgence, society remained stable the rest of the time. Modern culture often swings between constant excess and constant guilt. Medieval culture separated the two. You worked hard, then you feasted without shame. Bringing back intentional indulgence, rather than constant low-level overconsumption, might actually be healthier. Dressing animals for fun. One of the most quietly bizarre medieval trends was dressing animals in clothing. Horses wore decorated blankets, crests, and accessories. Dogs were dressed in miniature coats. Even farm animals were sometimes adorned during festivals. This wasn't about necessity. It was about spectacle. Animals were part of public life. They weren't hidden away or treated purely as property. They were participants in social events. A well-dressed horse wasn't just transportation, it was status, pride, and entertainment rolled into one. Today, pets wear clothes mostly as novelty. In medieval times, animal adornment was part of public display and celebration. It blurred the line between utility and joy. Professional fools who were allowed to say anything. The medieval jester wasn't just comic relief. It was an official role with surprising power. Fools were allowed, even expected, to mock kings, nobles, and institutions. They could speak truths others couldn't, disguised as jokes. The absurd costume wasn't a weakness. It was protection. Because they were ridiculous, they could be honest. Modern society lacks this role. Comedy exists, but it's often commercialized or politicized. The medieval fool served the court, but didn't belong to power. They reminded rulers that arrogance was dangerous. Bringing back respected spaces for sanctioned absurdity, where truth can be spoken without punishment, might actually strengthen leadership. Celebrating failure publicly. Medieval culture didn't hide failure the way modern culture does. Bad harvests, lost battles, and disasters were openly acknowledged. Communities prayed together, fasted together, and mourned together. Failure wasn't a personal flaw. It was a shared experience. Today, failure is often private and isolating. People hide mistakes and losses out of shame. Medieval society understood something important: pretending everything is fine doesn't make it better. Acknowledging failure publicly allowed communities to move forward together. One of the biggest mistakes people make about medieval society is assuming it was obsessed with control and order. In reality, medieval culture made room for chaos, intentionally. Not constant chaos, but scheduled chaos. Structured absurdity. Moments where normal rules didn't just loosen, they disappeared entirely. And some of the strangest medieval trends came directly from that mindset. Festivals where normal behavior was literally illegal. During certain medieval festivals, acting normal was considered wrong. Events like the Feast of Fools, Carnival, and various local holy days temporarily reversed social rules. Servants mocked masters. Poor people dressed as nobles. Authority figures were parodied openly in the streets. During these times, refusing to participate could even make you suspicious. Laughter, noise, costumes, and exaggerated behavior weren't optional. They were expected. The purpose wasn't rebellion. It was balance. Medieval people believed that suppressing chaos entirely would eventually cause it to explode uncontrollably. So instead, they gave it a release valve. Modern society often does the opposite. We try to regulate behavior constantly, allowing very few outlets for collective release. When tension builds, it has nowhere to go. Medieval festivals understood something deeply human: people need permission to be ridiculous sometimes. Wearing colors that were considered too much. In the medieval world, color mattered more than cut or comfort. Bright reds, deep blues, vibrant yellows, and intense purples weren't subtle fashion choices. They were statements. Dyes were expensive, difficult to produce, and highly symbolic. Wearing bold color wasn't about personal preference. It was about visibility. Some colors were considered morally dangerous. Too much brightness could be seen as prideful or provocative. Entire sermons were preached about excessive color in clothing. And yet people kept wearing it. Medieval fashion wasn't about minimalism. It was about impact. Modern fashion often cycles toward neutral tones and muted palettes. Medieval culture embraced saturation. Life was hard. Clothing didn't need to be dull too. There's something powerful about refusing to blend into the background. Ridiculous rules about table manners. Medieval etiquette could be astonishingly specific, and sometimes absurd. Rules governed how you cut bread, where you placed bones, how you wiped your hands, and even how loudly you were allowed to chew. Some etiquette manuals warned against staring too intensely at other diners' food. Others cautioned against dipping bread into shared sauces too aggressively. These rules weren't about refinement for its own sake. They existed because meals were shared closely. Plates, cups, and food were communal. Etiquette prevented conflict. Today, many people eat alone or distracted. Medieval meals were social performances. Manners mattered because relationships mattered. The absurdity wasn't the rules themselves, it was how seriously people took shared experiences. Public competitions for strange skills. Medieval towns loved competitions, but not always practical ones. There were contests for storytelling, insult poetry, memory, singing volume, and even endurance during awkward tasks. Some competitions rewarded people for being the most entertaining, not the most skilled. Winning wasn't always about being the best. It was about being memorable. Modern competitions often emphasize productivity or efficiency. Medieval contests emphasized presence. People gathered to watch others fail, improvise, and embarrass themselves, collectively and joyfully. It made entertainment participatory instead of passive. Fashion that intentionally restricted movement. It sounds uncomfortable, and it often was. Certain medieval fashion trends deliberately limited how people moved. Long sleeves dragged on the ground. Tight garments restricted steps. Heavy layers forced upright posture. These clothes weren't mistakes. They were signals. If you could wear impractical clothing, it meant you didn't need to labor. Restriction became a display of freedom. Today, comfort is king. Medieval fashion sometimes rejected comfort to communicate identity. While nobody wants daily discomfort, the idea that clothing can say more than "I dressed quickly" feels strangely lost. Bells, ribbons, and movement as performance. Movement mattered in medieval society. People decorated their clothes with ribbons, tassels, bells, and trailing fabric that emphasized motion. Walking, turning, and dancing became visual experiences. Clothing responded to the body instead of hiding it. Modern fashion often prioritizes stillness. Clothing looks best when standing or sitting, not moving. Medieval clothing came alive when people moved through space. It turned ordinary actions into spectacle, embracing the absurd instead of explaining it. Perhaps the biggest medieval trend of all was comfort with the unexplained. People believed in strange creatures, symbolic dreams, and meaningful coincidences. Not everything needed a logical explanation. Absurdity wasn't embarrassing. It was part of reality. Modern culture often demands justification for everything. Medieval culture allowed mystery to exist alongside daily life. That didn't make them ignorant, it made them imaginative. By now, it should be clear that medieval people weren't trying to optimize life the way we do today. They weren't obsessed with efficiency, speed, or constant improvement. They were obsessed with meaning. And some of the strangest medieval trends only make sense when you realize that symbolism mattered more than comfort, logic, or convenience. That's why even medieval people sometimes looked at other medieval customs and said, "That's a bit much." Medical practices that were half ritual, half guesswork. Medieval health trends were strange, not because people were foolish, but because medicine was deeply tied to belief. People didn't just treat the body. They treated the story around the body. Certain illnesses were treated with specific colors of clothing. Others required sleeping in particular directions. Some remedies involved carrying objects believed to absorb sickness simply by being nearby. To modern ears, this sounds absurd. But there was something powerful happening. Patients weren't passive. They participated in their healing. Ritual gave people a sense of control during uncertainty. Today, medicine is effective but impersonal. Medieval medicine was often ineffective, but deeply human. Bringing back the idea that healing includes belief, ritual, and participation might actually improve how people experience recovery. Consulting the stars for everyday decisions. Astrology wasn't entertainment in medieval society. It was guidance. People consulted the stars before planting crops, scheduling weddings, starting journeys, or even cutting their hair. Certain days were considered unlucky for travel. Others were ideal for negotiation or rest. This wasn't blind superstition. It was pattern seeking. Without modern forecasting tools, people relied on symbolic systems to impose order on uncertainty. Modern life is flooded with data, yet people often feel more anxious than ever. Medieval people accepted uncertainty and created rituals to navigate it. There's something calming about trusting a system, even an imperfect one, instead of constantly second-guessing every decision. Sleeping in public spaces without embarrassment. Privacy, as we understand it today, barely existed in medieval life. People slept in shared rooms, halls, and even workplaces. Inns often packed strangers into the same beds. Households slept communally for warmth and safety. And no one thought it was strange. Sleep wasn't private. It was practical. Modern society treats sleep as something deeply personal and hidden. Medieval society treated it as another shared activity. While personal space matters, the medieval comfort with vulnerability is striking. Being seen while resting wasn't weakness. It was normal. Rituals for everyday transitions. Medieval life was filled with small rituals marking ordinary moments. Starting a journey. Ending a work season. Moving into a new home. Recovering from illness. These moments were acknowledged publicly. Blessings were given. Words were spoken. Witnesses were present. Today, transitions are often silent. People move, change jobs, or recover alone. Medieval society understood that change is easier when it's shared. The ritual itself mattered more than its accuracy. Embracing slowness without apology. Medieval people didn't rush, not because they were lazy, but because rushing rarely helped. Travel was slow. Communication was slow. Change was slow. Instead of fighting this, people adapted emotionally. There was patience built into the culture. Waiting wasn't failure. It was normal. Modern life treats slowness as a flaw. Medieval life treated it as reality. There's something deeply calming about a society that doesn't expect instant results. Clothing that told personal stories. Beyond status, medieval clothing often reflected personal history. Repairs were visible. Patches were common. Wear and tear weren't hidden. A garment told a story of use, labor, celebration, and survival. Today, clothing is disposable. Damage is replaced, not repaired. Medieval people wore their history on their bodies, literally. That visible continuity created identity. Believing that joy was a responsibility. Perhaps the most overlooked medieval trend was the belief that joy wasn't optional. Feasts, festivals, laughter and celebration weren't indulgences, they were duties. Communities believed that failing to celebrate properly invited imbalance. Joy kept society healthy. Modern culture often treats joy as something you earn after productivity. Medieval culture treated joy as maintenance. By modern standards, medieval life looks inconvenient. But medieval people didn't see inconvenience as a problem to eliminate. They treated it as something to live with, and sometimes even enjoy. In many ways, medieval society turned limits into culture. And that's where some of the most absurd, but oddly appealing, trends emerge. Blurring work and play on purpose. In medieval communities, work and play weren't cleanly separated. Harvests involved music. Construction projects included jokes and shared meals. Even repetitive labor was often accompanied by songs or storytelling. Work wasn't silent. It wasn't isolated. And it wasn't rushed. People understood that effort without enjoyment leads to resentment. So they built pleasure into productivity. Modern life draws hard lines between work time and leisure time, and then complains that both feel unsatisfying. Medieval culture accepted that most of life is work, so it made work tolerable through community and rhythm. Fear of boredom more than exhaustion. Medieval people feared boredom more than fatigue. Long winters, slow travel, and limited entertainment meant boredom was a real threat. So communities actively created diversions. Games, riddles, debates, improvised performances, and contests filled empty time. Even arguments could become entertainment. Silence wasn't peaceful, it was suspicious. Today, boredom is filled instantly with screens. Medieval boredom demanded creativity. People entertained each other instead of consuming content. That skill is largely gone, and it's one worth reviving. Flexible timekeeping that didn't obsess over minutes. Medieval time wasn't precise. Clocks existed, but they weren't everywhere. Time was measured by daylight, church bells, meals, and seasons. Appointments were vague. Morning or after prayers was usually enough. People weren't late, they were contextual. Modern society measures time obsessively, down to seconds. Medieval society treated time as elastic. Life moved at the speed of humans, not machines. That flexibility reduced stress, even if it reduced efficiency, turning inconvenience into social interaction. Many medieval inconveniences forced people together. Fetching water, baking bread, grinding grain, these were communal tasks. Waiting wasn't lonely. It was social. People talked while they waited. News spread naturally. Relationships formed without scheduling. Modern convenience isolates people. Medieval inconvenience connected them. Bringing back shared effort, even in small ways, could restore everyday social bonds. Loudness as a sign of life. Medieval towns were noisy, and that was a good thing. Shouting vendors, ringing bells, street musicians, animals, arguments, laughter, sound meant activity. Silence suggested abandonment or danger. Modern cities often try to reduce noise. Medieval cities embraced it. Sound was proof that life was happening. While constant noise can be exhausting, total quiet can feel empty. Medieval people understood the comfort of shared sound, accepting that not everything needed improvement. Perhaps the most radical medieval mindset was acceptance. If something worked well enough, it stayed. Tools changed slowly. Traditions lasted generations. Progress wasn't assumed to be good by default. Modern culture constantly demands upgrades, faster, newer, better, even when the old version works. Medieval society asked a different question: is this good enough to live with? That question alone could reduce a lot of modern anxiety. Humor that didn't need permission. Medieval humor was blunt, physical, and unapologetic. Jokes were shared publicly. Mockery was expected. Laughter wasn't filtered. People laughed at themselves, their leaders, and their struggles. Humor wasn't curated, it was spontaneous. Modern humor is often cautious, fragmented, or Monetized. Medieval humor belonged to everyone. Living with limits instead of fighting them. Ultimately, medieval absurdity came from acceptance of limits. Limited medicine. Limited technology. Limited control. Instead of pretending limits didn't exist, medieval people built culture around them. Ritual, celebration, humor, and symbolism filled the gaps. Modern society tries to erase limits, and often feels more anxious as a result. Medieval society acknowledged limits, and found meaning anyway. At this point, it becomes obvious that medieval absurdity wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. Medieval people didn't reject logic, they just refused to let logic dominate every part of life. They understood something modern society often forgets: humans don't live on efficiency alone. They live on meaning. And many medieval trends that seem ridiculous today were actually ways of protecting that meaning. Loving predictable routines without feeling trapped. Medieval life followed rhythms that rarely changed. Workdays looked similar. Seasons repeated. Traditions stayed familiar year after year. And instead of feeling bored by repetition, people found comfort in it. Predictability wasn't confinement, it was stability. Modern culture often treats routine as something to escape. People chase novelty constantly, fearing stagnation. Medieval society didn't fear routine. It feared disorder. The routine gave people a framework so they could focus on relationships, storytelling, and celebration instead of constant decision-making. There's a strange freedom in knowing what comes next. Shared experiences over personal privacy. Medieval people shared almost everything. Meals, sleep, workspaces, celebrations, grief. Privacy existed, but it wasn't sacred. What mattered more was presence. People were rarely alone, and when they were, it usually wasn't for long. Modern life values privacy deeply, yet loneliness is widespread. Medieval life offered less solitude, but more connection. The absurd part isn't that medieval people shared so much, it's that we share so little now. Treating ritual as necessary, not optional. Modern rituals are often symbolic but optional. You participate if you feel like it. Medieval rituals were non-negotiable. They marked time, identity, belonging, and transition. Skipping them wasn't just unusual, it was destabilizing. Ritual gave structure to emotions people didn't know how to process alone. Grief had rules. Joy had schedules. Change had ceremonies. Modern society often leaves people to navigate emotional milestones alone. Medieval society never assumed you should handle life quietly, finding beauty in things that didn't last. Medieval people understood impermanence intimately. Clothing wore out. Buildings decayed. Life expectancy was uncertain. So beauty wasn't expected to last forever. Festivals were temporary. Decorations were reused. Moments mattered more than permanence. Modern culture often chases lasting impact, permanent posts, lasting achievements, eternal relevance. Medieval culture embraced fleeting joy. Something could matter deeply even if it disappeared tomorrow. That mindset reduces fear. Absurdity as a survival tool. Laughter wasn't a luxury. It was survival. Absurd humor, exaggerated fashion, ridiculous rituals, these weren't distractions from hardship. They were responses to it. When life was harsh, absurdity softened the edges. Medieval people didn't ask, "Does this make sense?" They asked, "Does this help us endure?" That's a powerful question. Why these trends still matter? Bringing medieval trends back doesn't mean rejecting modern progress. It means reclaiming balance. Celebration without justification. Community without scheduling. Ritual without embarrassment. Absurdity without apology. Medieval society reminds us that humans need more than comfort and convenience. They need shared meaning. They need permission to be ridiculous. Even after everything we've covered, medieval life still has more strange habits that feel oddly relevant today. That's because medieval society didn't try to remove friction from life. It accepted friction, and then wrapped culture around it. Some of the most absurd medieval trends weren't loud or dramatic. They were quiet assumptions about how people should exist together. And those assumptions feel almost radical now. Treating strangers as temporary community. In medieval towns, strangers weren't invisible. Travelers stayed in inns, monasteries, or private homes. They ate with others, slept near others, talked with others. You didn't disappear into anonymity the moment you arrived somewhere new. Hospitality wasn't politeness, it was survival. Refusing hospitality wasn't just rude. It was dangerous, because one day you might need the same kindness. Modern life allows people to pass through spaces without interacting at all. Medieval life assumed interaction by default. The absurdity is how normal that once was. Eating the same food at the same time. Medieval meals were synchronized. People ate when food was available, not whenever they felt like it. Town bells, work schedules, and daylight dictated mealtimes. As a result, meals were social events, not interruptions. Today, everyone eats on their own schedule. Medieval people ate together by necessity. That necessity created connection. The food mattered less than the shared moment. Accepting that comfort was occasional, not constant. Medieval people didn't expect to be comfortable all the time. Warmth, softness, and rest were appreciated because they weren't guaranteed. Comfort was something you noticed. Modern society tries to maintain constant comfort, climate control, endless entertainment, instant gratification. When comfort becomes constant, it becomes invisible. Medieval people felt joy more sharply because discomfort existed alongside it. Respecting elders for memory, not productivity. Older people in medieval communities weren't valued for speed or output. They were valued for memory. They remembered past winters, past failures, past solutions. They carried stories and experience that couldn't be written down easily. Modern society often sidelines people once they stop producing efficiently. Medieval society listened to those who remembered. That respect wasn't sentimental, it was practical. Letting children exist in public life. Medieval children weren't hidden away. They worked, played, learned, and misbehaved in public spaces. They watched adults constantly and learned by observation. Childhood wasn't overprotected or overmanaged. Children weren't treated as projects, they were treated as people in progress. Modern childhood is often isolated into special zones. Medieval childhood unfolded in the middle of real life. Accepting that life was uneven. Medieval people didn't expect fairness in every outcome. They believed life was unpredictable, uneven, and sometimes cruel, and instead of demanding constant correction, they adapted emotionally. That acceptance didn't make them passive. It made them resilient. Modern culture often promises fairness, then struggles when reality doesn't comply. Medieval culture prepared people for imbalance. Finding meaning without needing validation. There were no likes. No views. No metrics. If something mattered, it mattered because people felt it, not because it was recorded or rewarded. Moments existed even if no one documented them. Modern life often pressures people to prove meaning. Medieval life allowed meaning to exist quietly. Why medieval absurdity still resonates. What we call absurd today was often medieval society's way of protecting mental balance. Loud festivals countered long silence. Ridiculous fashion countered hard labor. Ritual countered uncertainty. Community countered fear. Medieval people didn't deny hardship. They answered it creatively. One of the strangest things about medieval society is how comfortable people were with emotional exposure. Modern life encourages emotional control. Medieval life encouraged emotional expression, publicly, openly, and without apology. And that difference created entire trends that feel shocking today. Public mourning without embarrassment. In medieval communities, grief was not private. When someone died, mourning was visible. People cried openly. Black clothing, armbands, or symbolic garments signaled loss to everyone else. Funerals weren't quiet affairs. They were communal acknowledgments of absence. Grief didn't have to be explained or hidden. It was recognized automatically. Modern society often pushes grief behind closed doors, encouraging people to move on quickly. Medieval society understood something vital: grief needs witnesses. That public acknowledgement didn't erase pain, but it prevented isolation. Open discussion of death without fear. Death was everywhere in medieval life. People didn't avoid it in conversation. They prepared for it spiritually, practically, and socially. Death wasn't morbid, it was familiar. People wrote wills early. They discussed burial preferences. They made peace publicly. Modern culture often avoids death entirely, treating it as taboo. Medieval culture treated it as inevitable, and therefore manageable. There is something grounding about acknowledging the end instead of pretending it doesn't exist. Mocking fear through art and humor. Medieval art was filled with strange imagery, dancing skeletons, talking animals, exaggerated demons, and humorous depictions of death. This wasn't obsession. It was defiance. By making fear ridiculous, medieval people took away its power. Laughter wasn't denial, it was resistance. Modern society often treats fear seriously and privately. Medieval society mocked it loudly. That mockery created emotional resilience. Accepting imperfection as normal. Medieval buildings weren't perfectly symmetrical. Roads weren't straight. Objects were handmade and uneven. Imperfection wasn't a flaw. It was expected. Modern life often chases perfection, flawless images, polished identities, curated appearances. Medieval people lived among visible flaws every day and didn't panic because of them. That acceptance reduced pressure. Things didn't need to be perfect to be useful or meaningful. Community memory over written records. While records existed, medieval societies relied heavily on memory. People remembered who helped them, who cheated them, who could be trusted. Reputation lived in conversation, not databases. Modern systems rely on documentation and metrics. Medieval systems relied on human memory. That made behavior matter. You couldn't hide behind anonymity forever. The absurd freedom of limited choice. Medieval people had fewer choices, and paradoxically, less anxiety about them. You didn't choose from endless careers, lifestyles, or identities. Your path was shaped by circumstance, family, and community. That limitation wasn't always fair, but it removed constant self-doubt. Modern life offers endless choice and endless comparison. Medieval life offered fewer paths and deeper commitment to the one you were on. Trusting tradition more than opinion. Medieval people respected tradition deeply. Not because tradition was always right, but because it had survived. Change happened slowly and cautiously. Modern culture often prioritizes novelty over durability. Medieval society asked, "Has this worked before?" before asking, "Is this new?" That caution prevented constant upheaval. Living with fewer explanations. Medieval people didn't expect explanations for everything. Some things simply were. Bad luck. Good fortune. Strange events. Not every experience needed analysis. Modern society often over-explains, over-analyzes, and over-justifies. Medieval people experienced life more directly, without constantly narrating it. That silence left room for intuition. After exploring absurd shoes, ridiculous hats, bells, feasts, public rituals, and even communal grief, one thing becomes clear: medieval life was strange, yes, but deeply human. These trends weren't random. They weren't just for show. They were deliberate responses to a harsh and uncertain world, responses designed to make life bearable, meaningful, and communal. Celebrating life despite hardship. Medieval people lived with constant uncertainty. Disease, short lifespans, famine, and war were everyday realities. Yet they didn't let that uncertainty dominate their emotions. They celebrated, laughed, and indulged in ritualized absurdity. Life was temporary. Joy had to be seized when it appeared. That's why festivals, feasts, and public laughter were not optional. They were essential. Modern life is safer, but that safety has come with a cost. We have comfort, convenience, and longevity, but we often lack shared moments of joy. We hide our emotions behind screens, schedules, and social norms. Medieval trends remind us that celebrating life isn't frivolous. It's necessary. Embracing absurdity as a strength. Absurd fashion, outrageous shoes, loud bells, and public displays of emotion all served a purpose. They broke monotony. They built community. They allowed people to laugh at fear, death, and even themselves. In modern culture, absurdity is often treated as weakness. Medieval culture treated it as resilience. Being publicly ridiculous wasn't shameful. It was survival. It reminded people that life doesn't always have to make sense, but it can still matter deeply. Ritual, repetition, and shared meaning. One of the most underrated aspects of medieval life was ritual. From public feasts to seasonal festivals to funeral processions, rituals punctuated life. They gave structure, provided emotional outlets, and strengthened community bonds. Modern society often skips ritual entirely, leaving milestones to individual interpretation. Without ritual, transitions can feel chaotic, celebrations feel hollow, and grief feels isolating. Medieval society recognized that structure, repetition, and shared expectation weren't constraints, they were life support systems. What we could bring back. We don't need to wear absurdly long shoes or tie bells to our hats, though that would be fun. What we could bring back is the mindset. Joy without apology. Community without constant productivity. Humor without fear of judgment. Shared rituals that mark life's milestones. Acceptance of imperfection and limits. The freedom to embrace absurdity as part of living fully. Medieval society survived extreme hardship not by hiding from it, but by building culture around it. Their absurd trends weren't distractions. They were strategies for living. Even after exploring joy, absurdity, and communal life, there are still countless medieval trends that modern society could learn from. These aren't just quirky customs, they were strategies for living fully in a harsh world. Clothing that communicated personality. In medieval life, what you wore didn't just indicate wealth or class, it told a story about you. Colors, fabrics, trims, and even the way you patched a garment communicated identity. One could show skill, creativity, loyalty, or rebellion just through clothing. Modern fashion often prioritizes brand or trend over storytelling. Medieval clothing demanded attention and interpretation. Imagine if our daily wardrobe could express a narrative about who we are and what we value, without saying a word. Public performance as a part of life. Street performers, troubadours, and traveling minstrels were integral to towns and villages. Their presence wasn't optional. Music, storytelling, and comedy were woven into daily life. Workdays, markets, and festivals all included performance. Modern society separates art from daily living. Medieval people lived in a world where creativity was ambient and unavoidable. Daily life became more colorful because culture was everywhere, not hidden in museums or online streams. Humor without boundaries. Jesters, fools, and pranksters weren't just tolerated, they were required. They could speak truth, mock authority, and highlight absurdities that no one else dared to mention. Humor was functional. It helped people survive stress, diffuse tension, and recognize the absurdity of their own hardships. Modern comedy often feels transactional or filtered through politics and algorithms. Medieval humor belonged to everyone, and it served society itself. Embracing temporary beauty. Everything in medieval life was understood to be temporary. Feasts were extravagant but short. Decorations were elaborate but transient. Clothing wore out quickly, and craftsmanship often reflected the impermanence of life. Modern culture obsessively seeks permanence. Instagram, archival content, collectibles. Medieval people embraced the fleeting nature of beauty, which made each moment feel more precious. There's a lesson here: you don't need everything to last forever to make it meaningful. Community accountability. In medieval towns, social rules were enforced by visibility. Gossip, reputation, and participation in rituals kept people accountable. Public shame, communal judgment, and social expectations created cohesion. Modern society relies on abstract systems for accountability. Medieval communities relied on relationships. The absurdity of public scrutiny often created moral behavior more effectively than laws or punishments alone. Festivals that reversed reality. Medieval festivals were not just for fun. They inverted social hierarchies. Servants became masters for a day. Nobles were mocked publicly. Ordinary citizens were celebrated. This temporary reversal reminded people that society was a construct, and that flexibility, humor, and humility were essential. Modern life is rigid. We could learn from sanctioned chaos, structured freedom as a tool for mental balance. Play as preparation. Games, contests, and performances weren't just entertainment, they were training for life. Sharpening memory, agility, negotiation, or humor prepared people for real challenges. Modern society often separates play from preparation, making both less effective. Medieval life understood that joy and skill building could be the same activity. Medieval life wasn't about efficiency or practicality. It was about human experience, shared, amplified, and sometimes ridiculous. And some of the strangest trends highlight that philosophy in ways modern life could benefit from. Public displays of emotion. Medieval society accepted that feelings were meant to be visible. Mourning was performed openly, with rituals, attire, and public acknowledgement. Joy was loud, messy, and collective during feasts and festivals. Anger, frustration, and rivalry were expressed in public games, debates, and storytelling. Modern society often hides emotion, treating vulnerability as weakness. Medieval life treated it as normal, even necessary. When emotions are communal, they are also managed and shared, reducing isolation. Temporary absurd fashion as social commentary. Some of the most extreme medieval trends were purposefully impractical clothing or accessories. Oversized hats, elongated shoes, or flowing robes weren't just decorative. They communicated status, wealth, or even moral alignment. Sometimes they were jokes, designed to mock fashion or societal rules. Fashion became both statement and spectacle. Today, clothing is mostly functional or cosmetic. Medieval fashion demanded presence, creativity, and conversation. Humor as social glue. Jesters, fools, and street performers were vital. They could speak uncomfortable truths disguised as jokes, satirize authority, bring the community together through shared laughter. Humor wasn't just entertainment, it was a tool for social balance. It reminded everyone not to take life too seriously and allowed critique without punishment. Modern comedy often feels filtered or transactional. Medieval humor belonged to everyone and served society itself. The value of ritualized absurdity. From festivals to feast days to religious processions, ritual permeated daily life. Even absurdity was ritualized. Wearing ridiculous clothing on specific days. Acting out inverted social roles during festivals. Singing, dancing, or playing games as communal obligations. Modern life treats ritual as optional or ceremonial at best. Medieval society recognized ritual as emotional infrastructure. It gave life structure and meaning. Shared labor as community building. Daily work often included social interaction. Fields, mills, and workshops became hubs for storytelling and song. Tasks were done collectively rather than in isolation. Work itself was often a form of entertainment. Modern life separates labor from joy. Medieval labor was embedded with culture, creating connection and reducing monotony. Accepting limits as a lifestyle. Medieval life was constrained by technology, medical knowledge, travel speed, social hierarchy. Yet these limitations didn't create despair. They created opportunities for creativity, ceremony, and social cohesion. Modern society fights every limitation, often creating anxiety and dissatisfaction. Medieval people thrived within boundaries. Transience as a source of appreciation. Nothing lasted forever. Clothing wore out quickly. Feasts were temporary. Buildings decayed. This impermanence gave every moment meaning. Medieval people understood fleeting joy. Modern culture chases permanence, but medieval society celebrated ephemeral experience. Medieval life might seem harsh, chaotic, or just plain absurd from a modern perspective, but every strange custom had a purpose. Many of these trends were clever ways of creating community, joy, and resilience. Public competitions for odd skills. Medieval towns loved contests, and they weren't always practical. People competed in storytelling, joke-telling, or insult contests. Some contests tested memory, endurance, or absurd feats of dexterity. Winning often wasn't about being the best, it was about being memorable and entertaining. Modern competitions focus on efficiency or measurable achievement. Medieval contests emphasized creativity, social skill, and shared amusement. Communal sleep and privacy norms. Privacy in medieval life was minimal. Families often slept together in shared rooms. Travelers stayed in crowded inns. Sleep was a social activity, not a hidden one. Modern society treats sleep as intensely private. Medieval people were comfortable with visibility and learned to rest in community, which built trust and connection. Animals as social participants. Animals weren't just tools, they were integrated into human social life. Horses wore decorative harnesses for festivals. Dogs accompanied humans in public spaces and were sometimes dressed. Even farm animals participated in community events. Modern society separates animals from public life or treats them purely as pets. Medieval culture gave them roles in spectacle and celebration, blurring the line between utility and joy. Over-the-top hairstyles and beauty practices. Beauty was extreme and symbolic. Women shaved hairlines to create intelligent high foreheads. Eyebrows were plucked or painted on. Hair and hats were often used to display social rank or wealth. Modern beauty standards push subtlety or natural appearance. Medieval beauty was loud, visible, and unapologetically symbolic. Absurd etiquette that encouraged social awareness. Meals, conversation, and public behavior were heavily ritualized. Rules dictated how to handle utensils, share food, or even chew. Some rules were moral, some were humorous, and others simply maintained civility. Observing etiquette kept people mindful of one another. Today, manners are optional or perfunctory. Medieval etiquette built empathy and attention into daily life, even if it seemed ridiculous. Festivals that reversed roles. Feasts and celebrations often temporarily overturned social hierarchies. Servants mocked masters. Ordinary citizens could parody nobles. Chaos was permitted, even encouraged, but only in structured ways. These festivals reminded people that life is flexible. Modern society rarely allows sanctioned social reversals, but medieval culture understood their value. Laughter as survival. In medieval life, humor wasn't optional. It was a defense against hardship. It built bonds and mitigated fear. Fools and jesters had an important social function, speaking truths that others could not. Modern humor is often private or commercialized. Medieval humor was essential and communal. Medieval life was full of practices that seem bizarre now but were actually designed to make life more human, connected, and meaningful. Beyond festivals, absurd fashion, and public humor, there were everyday habits that modern society could benefit from adopting. Shared knowledge through oral tradition. Medieval communities didn't rely on printed manuals or screens. They relied on oral transmission. Stories, instructions, and skills were passed down verbally. Memory was a prized skill, elders and storytellers were highly respected. Humor, morals, and practical knowledge were all integrated into communal storytelling. Modern society often isolates knowledge in books or online. Medieval people lived knowledge collectively, which strengthened community bonds. Rituals for minor life events. Major events like births, marriages, and deaths were ritualized, but so were smaller ones. Starting a new task, harvesting crops, or moving into a new house often had ceremonies. These rituals didn't need to be religious, they just marked transitions. They gave meaning to otherwise mundane events. Today, small transitions often go unnoticed. Medieval society recognized that life is a collection of moments, each worth marking. Deliberate clothing restrictions. Many medieval fashion trends intentionally restricted movement. Long sleeves or trailing garments required careful walking. Tight bodices, corsets, and heavy cloaks limited mobility. These were not just vanity. They were status symbols. Clothing that limited movement signaled that the wearer didn't need to labor. Modern fashion prioritizes comfort, but medieval fashion communicated identity, wealth, and social position through absurd impracticality. Public competitions for humor and wit. Games and contests weren't always athletic or practical. Villagers competed in witty insults, storytelling, riddles, and creative improvisation. Success often depended on cleverness, humor, and personality rather than skill. These competitions reinforced social cohesion and entertained the community. Modern contests often reward efficiency or measurable output. Medieval competitions rewarded creativity, memory, and social intelligence. Acceptance of impermanence. Everything in medieval life was impermanent. Clothing wore out quickly. Food was seasonal and perishable. Buildings decayed over time. This impermanence made joy and celebration more urgent and meaningful. Modern culture chases permanence, often causing stress. Medieval people cherished the temporary. Festivals that encouraged chaos. Structured chaos was an essential part of medieval festivals. Social hierarchies were temporarily inverted. Everyone participated, from peasants to nobles. Mockery, absurdity, and play were sanctioned. Modern society rarely encourages this kind of sanctioned chaos. Medieval culture understood that controlled absurdity was necessary for social balance and emotional health. Humor in the face of danger. Life was harsh and unpredictable. Humor was a survival mechanism. Fools and jesters spoke truths disguised as jokes. Satire and absurdity reduced fear and tension. Laughter became a communal tool to cope with mortality, disease, and hardship. Modern humor often exists online or privately. Medieval humor actively built community and resilience. Medieval society may appear chaotic, absurd, or even inconvenient, but nearly every trend had a purpose: building community, resilience, and emotional intelligence. In this part, we explore more of these fascinating practices. Public storytelling as education. Storytelling wasn't just entertainment, it was a way to teach life skills. Villagers learned history, ethics, and practical knowledge through stories. Moral lessons, strategies for survival, and social norms were embedded in narrative. Everyone, from children to adults, participated in listening and retelling. Modern education isolates learning from social life. Medieval storytelling made learning communal, memorable, and meaningful. Absurd hairstyles and fashion statements. Exaggerated hairstyles, huge hats, and long shoes were common. They signaled wealth, rank, or intelligence. They allowed creative expression and humor in public life. Often, these trends were intentionally impractical, a bold statement of status through absurdity. Modern fashion values comfort and subtlety. Medieval fashion made identity unavoidable and playful. Ritualized work and celebration. Even mundane labor had ritualistic elements. Harvesting crops often included music and dance. Milling grain or baking bread could be communal and festive. Work wasn't just functional, it was an opportunity for connection and expression. Modern labor often isolates and tires us. Medieval rituals turned work into social and emotional sustenance. Humor as a social safety valve. Laughter served a functional purpose. Jesters, pranks, and absurd performances allowed criticism without anger. Humor helped communities cope with uncertainty, disease, and mortality. Shared laughter reinforced bonds and reduced tension. Today, humor is often private or commodified. Medieval humor was an essential part of daily survival. Festivals with temporary anarchy. Feasts and festivals were deliberately chaotic. Social norms were inverted temporarily. Servants could mock masters, citizens could parody nobility. Public absurdity reminded people that life didn't have to be rigid. Modern culture often punishes chaos. Medieval culture structured freedom into society. Shared sleep and communal life. Privacy was minimal. Families often slept together. Travelers shared beds in inns. Sleep was social, not solitary. This communal approach built trust, empathy, and connection, something modern isolation rarely provides. Acceptance of limits. Life in medieval times was constrained by technology, medicine, and travel. Social hierarchy. Seasonal resources. Instead of frustration, people embraced these limits. Limits became a canvas for creativity, ritual, and community. Modern life fights limits, often generating stress. Medieval acceptance brought resilience. After exploring absurd fashion, public humor, ritualized work, communal sleep, and festivals of chaos, it's clear that medieval life was far stranger and far richer than we often imagine. The final trends show why these practices weren't just quirks, but tools for living fully and meaningfully. Music and noise as life signals. Medieval towns weren't quiet, and that was intentional. Bells, street performers, animals, and vendors created a constant soundscape. Noise wasn't pollution, it was proof that life was happening. People knew who was working, celebrating, or traveling just by listening. Modern life tries to reduce noise, but medieval noise built awareness, community, and safety. Children in public life. Children weren't separated from adult activity. They worked, learned, and played in communal spaces. Childhood was not isolated, it was integrated into real life. Mistakes were visible, but part of social learning. Modern childhood often isolates children in structured environments. Medieval practices allowed observation, participation, and social skill building. Humor, absurdity, and survival. Absurdity wasn't just entertainment, it was essential. Jesters, pranks, and ridiculous fashion eased stress. Humor normalized fear and uncertainty. Absurdity reminded communities that life could be harsh but survivable. Today, humor is privatized or commercialized. Medieval humor served the collective psyche. Rituals as emotional infrastructure. Ritual wasn't optional, it shaped daily life. Festivals, feasts, and public ceremonies punctuated the year. Small transitions, starting work, harvesting, moving, were marked. Ritual helped people process grief, joy, and change. Modern society often ignores ritual, leaving emotional processing to individuals. Medieval rituals provided structure and community support. Acceptance of limits and mortality. Medieval life imposed limits. Scarce resources, slow travel, and short lifespans. Inequality and unpredictable events. Instead of frustration, people embraced these limits, turning constraints into creativity, community bonding, and resilience. Death and mortality were publicly acknowledged, not hidden, allowing people to live fully in the present. Ephemeral beauty and shared meaning. Life was understood to be temporary. Clothing, buildings, and food were impermanent. Festivals and feasts were brief but celebrated collectively. Modern life often obsesses over permanence. Medieval society found meaning in the fleeting, which made every celebration sharper and more memorable. Joy as a duty. Perhaps the most radical medieval idea, joy was mandatory. Laughter, celebration, and absurdity weren't indulgences, they were socially required. Happiness maintained community morale and human resilience. Modern society treats joy as optional, or earned only after work. Medieval society treated joy as essential, a practice we could all benefit from today. Looking back, the absurd, inconvenient, and sometimes ridiculous trends of medieval life weren't failures of logic. They were deliberate strategies to survive, connect, and thrive emotionally. We might never wear enormous shoes, tie bells to our clothing, or hold entire accountable with public humor. But we can adopt the mindset behind these practices. Embrace absurdity. Celebrate life openly. Accept limits and impermanence. Ritualize, no matter how small. Share labor, sleep, and joy. Laugh in the face of uncertainty. Medieval life reminds us that human survival isn't just about longevity or efficiency, it's about living fully, socially, and emotionally. Absurd as it was, medieval culture offers a blueprint for reclaiming joy, connection, and meaning in a modern world that often forgets them.